Welcome, everyone, to the Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. This session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with the link on our website. Our website is icssmarx.org. ICSS stands for the Institute for the Critical Study of Society. For a decade and a half, our sessions were held at the Marxist Library in Oakland, California. Now we host our sessions on Zoom, and I should say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as we have speakers and attendees from around the United States and throughout the world. My name is Sharon, and I'm today's moderator. I'm a member of the ICSS Program Committee that organizes the forum. Our committee always welcomes input, feedback, and suggestions for topics and speakers. And you can contact us through our website, again, icssmarx.org. This is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. As such, we ask that you show respect for our participants and the moderator of today's session. Please note that the opinions expressed are those of the speaker and participants. They do not necessarily represent those of ICSS. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Marx's 11 Theses on Feuerbach. The philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Our speaker today is Mark Albertson, who is a frequent presenter at our forum. Mark is a military historian with a commanding knowledge of geopolitics. He is the historical research editor at Army Aviation magazine and is the historian for the Army Aviation Association of America. He has authored several books, including USS Connecticut, Constitution State Battleship, They'll Have to Follow You, The Triumph of the Great White Fleet, On History, a Treatise. He is at work on a 2-volume history on the saga of Army aviation. Mark teaches history at Norwalk Community College in Norwalk, Connecticut. Today, continuing our observance of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and its impact on the lives of all the world's people since then, Mark's topic is the Great Patriotic War and its aftermath. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler hurled 3,300,000 German troops against the Soviet Union, the start of the greatest land war in modern times. It will be the Soviets, not the United States and the Western Allies, who will win the land war, defeating the German army. During the second chapter of the Great War, Britain will incur 495,000 dead, and for the U.S., 405,399. A colossal 25 million, 1 in every 7 in the Soviet Union, will die in 47 months. Yet the Eastern Front will loom large in the irrevocable alteration of the global dynamics of power. No longer will the Europeans dominate the globe. The 2 big winners were the US and the USSR. This marked a new global geopolitics and ushered in the Cold War. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mark Albertson. Please go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in. Yes, that's true. This is the greatest land war in modern times, and it's the land campaign that decides who's going to win the land war in what we call World War II. But really, in reality, this is a war that did not start in 1939. It's a war that started in 1914. I gave a different talk on that, but basically, the first chapter was 1914 to 1922, not 1918. And the second chapter is 1931, when the Japanese opened up and they invaded Manchuria in September of 1931. Coming to its conclusion its cataclysmic conclusion in 1945. And this is man's greatest industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. The Soviets were late to this end of the game, and it's Stalin who industrialized this country. Now, the people can say whatever they want about Joe Stalin, but between 1927 and 1949, he took a backward peasant economy to an atomic bomb in 22 years. If 5 million people starved to death, he doesn't really care. I want what I want, end of discussion. And this Soviet industrialization, and it irks me that other historians don't pick up on this, is one of the biggest secrets for Allied victory in World War II. Because in the end, Lend-Lease will be merely 10 to 12% of the Soviet effort. This effort will be largely done by the Soviets themselves. They are the ones who win this war. And they are the ones, interestingly enough, the United States in World War II produced over 295,000 combat aircraft. Yet, lost in the shuffle, the Soviets produced over 158,327 of them. The United States will build 102,371 tanks. The Soviets will build upwards of 121,000. The United States will build 250,000 artillery pieces. The Soviets, over 500,000, 522,000. Now, we have to be honest here too, the United States has a two-ocean navy, has a strategic air force. The Soviets will eschew a navy overall, and they will not concentrate on strategic bombing. The British and the United States take care of that chore. The Soviets will concentrate on having an air force that supports the army. That's what they will do. In fact, they have a plane that denotes that. It's called the IL-2 Sturmovik. Arguably, Eddie Rickenbacker saw this plane, and arguably it is the greatest ground support plane, tank buster of the war. Even had armored undersides to it. Almost like in fact, some people used to call it the flying tank. It is the most produced combat plane in history at 36,183 copies. And it was a superlative aircraft, mated up with the T-34 tank, which, by the way, was the best tank made by any Allied power. Maybe the fit and finish wasn't all that great, but the tank had sloped armor for a shell to bounce off from it. It had a diesel engine to cut down on the fire hazard. It had 19-inch treads where it could go through territory another tank couldn't go through, and went through a series of marks. But it is the most produced tank of the war, not the Sherman. The Sherman, there were like 49,259 copies made. The T-34, 54,550 copies. That's a lot of tanks. In fact, the largest tank-producing combine of the war was not Detroit, it was Chelyabinsk in the Urals, although the Russians had a slang name for it, Tankograd. Now, in 1940, September 1940, this is a pretty good place to start. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and militarist Japan signed the Tripartite Pact. Now, some of this was against the Soviet Union, especially with regards to Japan. Remember, in the border, where Inner Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, and the Soviets and the Japanese had fought, and Georgy Zhukov beat them. However, they're interested in going to the South Pacific. And the reason they are is the Dutch East Indies. That's where the oil is. That's where the oil is. So the Army and Navy are together here in Japan. We don't want to go into Siberia. We want to go south. This is also a message to the United States. Germany, Japan, Italy, we're all united here. Yet the Japanese are thinking, now it's fascinating what they come up with here during the fall of 1940. They want to take the Tripartite Pact and admit the Soviets into this. And they had spheres of influence. In fact, I've been giving a talk lately called Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. And I got into the idea that perhaps Trump is trying to develop spheres of influence between him, Putin, and perhaps Xi Jinping, because he knows the United States is declining. This is the Japanese in 1940. Let's admit the Soviets. They had spheres of influences for all the participants. They pitched this to Mussolini. They pitched it to Hitler. Hitler says no. He's already drawing up his plans to attack the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. In fact, if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, "The future of the Reich is in the East, not the West." Now, why is that? That's where all the resources are. I mean, he's no different than the leader of any other great power that wants Eurasia. Even today, that's the target. You think the CIA doesn't have plans to break up the Russian Federation? Why? Because that's where the resources are. That's where the oil, the gas, the gold, the silver, the uranium, the tungsten, the manganese, the iron ore. Ukraine is a breadbasket. What do you think Hitler wanted this for in 41? It's the same show. This is still My Fair Lady. It's just a different cast of characters. That's all this is. The same play. Man can't seem to get off the merry-go-round. But Hitler's going to invade the Soviet Union. And again, as was made in the introduction, at 03:15 in the morning, June 22nd, 1941, three big armies, Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group South, 3,300,000 German troops attacked the Soviet Union. Now, what happened here on the first day? Get this, the first day. The Luftwaffe destroyed 1,400 Soviet aircraft, 600 the next. The entire frontline strength of the world's largest air force is now wiped out. On the first day, the German army, probably the best army in the world at this point, the German army wiped out 3 Soviet infantry divisions. We're not talking battalions, regiments, or brigades. We're talking whole divisions. 3 wiped out, 5 others cut to pieces. 100,000 men are off the board in 24 hours. In a week, Heinz Guderian, the great armor theorist, is 1/3 the way to Moscow. He's over 200 miles deep inside the Soviet Union with his tanks. In 2 weeks, the Soviets have more dead than this country will lose in the entire war. In a month, the Germans have captured an area twice the size of their own country. Now, this is not an impending military defeat. It is turning out to be an unmitigated disaster. And so at this point, Stalin gets up and leaves. Now, you wouldn't think this is Stalin. And so he gets up and leaves and goes to his dacha. They're leaderless. They're rudderless. Well, they have to go get them. Now's the time, if you don't like them, now's the time to get rid of them. Boris Saprashnikov, Vyacheslav Molotov, and representatives from the NKVD. Now, I don't know about you, but if the chief of the KGB was on my doorstep at 9 o'clock in the morning, this is not the start of a good day. And so they find him. He's unshaven, somewhat disheveled, and they tell him, "We need you." He thinks otherwise. They're here to knock him off. No, we need you. He gets his guts. He goes back to Moscow. And on July 3rd, 1941, he gives what you can call a rousing speech. And he titles this The Great Patriotic War. That was from Stalin's lips. Now, keep in mind what you're seeing here. Stalin's back, because Russian Army Group Center here, facing German Army Group Center, is falling apart. Stalin takes General Popov and his entire staff and shoots them all, brings in new commanders. He's not fooling around here, and you can't, not in this situation. Hitler, though, interestingly enough, and this is what really galled Heinz Guderian, stops the offensive. This is in August of 1941. He takes tanks from Army Group Center, sends them to the attack on Leningrad, takes other armored division, sends them to the south. He's interrupted the offensive on Moscow. And so Guderian says, "Just give me the tanks. I'll get to Moscow. Let's get them before they wake up." And that's not what Hitler's going to do. And so by the time September, the end of September rolls around, Hitler brings the tanks back from north and south and gives them to the Army Group Center And now they begin the run to Moscow. Let's get this over with. Now, keep in mind something else you're seeing here. You know, what worked for the Germans and France the summer before will not work here in the Soviet Union. Keep in mind, take a look at a map and see how big France is compared to the Soviet Union. You know, France fell in 6 weeks. Of course, there's another difference here. Hitler's not fighting the French. He's fighting the Russians. That's different. And interesting here, Hitler will attack the Soviet Union with 600,000 motor vehicles. Keep in mind, he's got a weakness here. Germany during the entire war will produce only 400,000 motor vehicles. The rest of them, well, they were captured French and Czech trucks. They still have to use the horse. In the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans will use 625,000 horses. Now, understand something here. If Heinz Guderian is making 50 miles, 60 miles a day with his tanks, and some of his supplies are being moved up by horse, how many miles a day do you think a horse is doing? 15? 17? Let's be generous. How about 20? That means Guderian's got to stop periodically and allow the supplies to catch up. How about trains? You would think they would move their equipment by trains, right? The problem here is the Soviet tracking is of a different gauge than the European tracking, so you've got to rip up the tracks, lay down a fresh bed of tracks, and keep moving. Now, keep in mind here, by October 1, 1941, the Germans are on their way toward Moscow. Now, you've had your first freeze and you've had your first snows, but the middle of the month, you've had some rains and a thaw. 95% of Soviet roads are dirt. They're not paved. How do you think these roads are? That's another impediment here for the Germans. But once it gets cold and once the ground freezes, Hitler's panzers are moving again. Now, keep in mind, into November, where do you think the temperatures are really beginning to go here? They're dropping, it's dropping like lead. And by November 26, 1941, Hitler his troops are beginning to encircle Moscow. Now note this, that's the same day the Japanese carrier fleet leaves northern Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. By the night of December 4-5, 1941, the Germans are only 15 miles from the Kremlin. They can see the spires of the Kremlin. And they don't know the Russians have brought in a lot of divisions from their Far Eastern Army and another 1,000 tanks. And on the night of December 4-5, 1941, and the temperatures are 40 degrees below zero, Zhukov launches his counterattack. This attack will last until the end of February 1942. Yet, 2 days later, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. Now, unlike other historians, I believe this is the turning point of the war. The Soviets pushed the Germans back 100 miles from Moscow. Now Hitler's stuck in a long war of attrition he can't wage. The Japanese have waken up the United States. They are now stuck in a long war of attrition they can't afford to wage. And you're beginning to see here by 1942, the two countries that are going to win this war, the US and the Soviet Union, beginning to take control of it. And I'll give you an example. In 1942, Hitler's Germany will produce 5,997 tanks and assault guns. The Soviets, without our help, will produce 24,668. 13,500 of these were the T-34. Again, the best tank produced by the Allies. This does not bode well for the Germans, because what you're going to see develop here in the late August 1942, and it will end on February 3rd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad. Yet, interestingly enough, and I criticize some historians for not doing this, the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Pacific. This is a battle of attrition against the Japanese. Stalingrad was a battle of attrition against the Germans, and they happen at the same time. Note the calendar here. The Marines landed on Guadalcanal August 742. Yet the Battle of Stalingrad starts near the end of August. Yet they both end about the same day. They both end about the same day. And so while the United States is sticking it to the Japanese and the Solomons, the Soviets are sticking it to the Germans in Stalingrad. Now, keep in mind, by February 3rd, 1943, in that 6 months, there were 1.9 million casualties. It's the costliest battle of the entire war. 1.1 million were Soviet. Yet, the Soviets inflicted such a loss of equipment on the Germans lost enough weapons and equipment to equip 1/4 of the entire German army. And they're not going to bounce back from this. The Japanese, their Navy lost 24 combat ships at Guadalcanal. The United States lost 24. Who do you think's going to replace these losses faster? The two victors. They have the industrial infrastructure you need to wage an industrialized war. That's what we're looking at here. That's what we're looking at. And so in 43, there'll be another big battle on the Eastern Front, the greatest air-land battle in the history of war. It's called Kursk. And at Kursk, there were 1 million Germans against 2.2 million Soviets. At one point, the Germans are losing 10,000 men a day. Get a load of that, 10,000 men. China can afford this, the Germans sure can't. And the Germans will run out of gas. And then Stalin's going to unleash his reserves and push the Germans clear across Ukraine back towards Eastern Europe. This leads to something that's very important here, and I want to get to this. The Tehran Conference, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. Now keep in mind here, Churchill and Roosevelt, they're using Stalin here. Let's understand something. The British lost 903,000 dead in what we call the First World War. They can't afford to lose another 903,000 dead. So let the Soviets fight the Germans here. The United States, same way. How do you think America would have reacted if it had lost 25 million in this war? We're not used to this. We are not used to this. The Russians, they've been invaded on and off all through their century, for Pete's sakes, and I'm going to get to that before we're finished. But at the Tehran Conference, it's here that Roosevelt and Churchill tell Stalin, we're going to hit the beaches in northwest France in May of 1944. Stalin's going to say thank you very much, and I will launch a huge offensive on the Eastern Front 2 weeks after the guys hit the beaches in France. And he said, I'll take the pressure off. That's nice to be polite. He's polite because he knows what he's going to get. He's getting Eastern and Central Europe out of this. The man's not stupid. He's not stupid. But they don't land in France until June 6, 1944. Everyone calls it D-Day, Normandy, the big landing in France here. But that's 156,000 men who are landed here, dropped by parachute, crash land by glider, land on the beaches. 156,000 men on a 50-60 mile front across the beaches of France. Of course, do you know how many men Eisenhower's going to have in France in 5 weeks? 800,000. Yet, on the Eastern Front, June 22nd, 1944. And Stalin himself picked this day. It's the 3rd anniversary of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. This offensive is not going to be on a front 50, 60 miles across. Try 450 miles, later broadened to 650 miles. He's not using 156,000 men. He's using 2.5 million men in 4 huge armies. And they will launch this attack on June 22nd, 1944, against German Army Group Center. This army is 800,000 men, doesn't have nearly the tanks and artillery that the Soviets have. And in 8 weeks, coming out of Belarusia, just west of Minsk, the Soviets, out of 800,000 men in that German army, over 300,000 are killed, over 250,000 are wounded, and over 60,000 are taken prisoner. This army is destroyed. This army is destroyed. But in 8 weeks, by the end of August 1944, the Soviets are now in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're in East Prussia. They're the first Allied army to have a foothold in Germany. They're in Poland against the Vistula River, which means they're on the gates of Warsaw. They are also in Romania. They're in 6 countries. They are only near Warsaw. They're only 350 miles from Berlin. That's all they are. The Polish Home Army rises up, and they think they're getting help from Stalin. Stalin won't lift a finger to help them because he wants Warsaw. Let the Germans kill off the Home Army. I'm not going to bother. And that's exactly what he's going to get. He got what he wanted. However, the Allies are moving across France, and by the beginning of 1945, both West and East, they are now in Germany. The Soviets are into East Germany, what we call East Germany. The Allies are into West Germany. This leads to the Yalta Conference, February 11, 1945. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because I want to get to the conclusion here, after the aftermath. Interesting here at Yalta, the German General Staff, that was supposed to have been dissolved after the first chapter of this conflict, and the Germans didn't do it. Now they're definitely going to do it. And Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin agree. We're going to have to dissolve the German General Staff. Stalin says, according to my intelligence, there's 50,000 men in the German General Staff, and we have to dissolve this. Stalin has a way to dissolve the General Staff. He says, how about shooting them all? Roosevelt says, and thinking he's kidding, he says, well, maybe we won't shoot all 50,000. Maybe we'll shoot just 49,000. Churchill knows Stalin's not kidding. And he says, I would rather be taken by the scruff of the neck out into the courtyard and shot than be part of such an iniquity. How about Poland? Churchill wants Stalin out of Poland so bad he can taste it. In fact, he wants to fly in the Free Polish government. Stalin's bringing in the Lublin Poles. They will be the communist government here in Warsaw. Churchill is working from a position of weakness. Britain is declining. That does not bode well for Churchill in his negotiations here with Stalin as to Poland. And interestingly enough, Churchill's going to have to resort to saying, look, if you don't get out of Poland, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Pope isn't going to like it. The Pope will not like it that you won't get out of Poland. Well, Poles are mostly what? Catholics here? Of course. And finally, Stalin says to him, the Pope? How many divisions does he have? What is he? He knows the Pope no longer has the Papal States. He's a little man consigned to 108 acres. What's Stalin afraid of? The Swiss Guard here? Greece. Now, that's another one. Churchill will get what he wants with Greece. Churchill will get what he wants with Greece because he said, if we let Greece, Eastern and Central Europe are going to the Soviets. But if Greece falls, Churchill brings up the point of what you're going to hear later on with Korea and Vietnam. Remember the domino theory? If we lose Greece, there goes Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, so on and so forth. That's what Churchill says. But Greece will stay with the Western camp, and Stalin sold out the communist guerrillas here, and they will be killed by the free Greeks, if they want to call them free Greeks. But so Greece will remain in the Western camp. But Berlin is going to the Soviets. No matter what General Montgomery wanted, no matter what General Patton wanted, they both wanted to take Berlin because that gets your name in the history books. Let's be honest here. It will be Zhukov in the end who gets Berlin. And that will be the end of the war. But having said that, interesting here that also came up during the Yalta conference, and I find this is significant. You remember, we lived the Cold War, so you remember that Germany was divided into a pie of 4 pieces, right? The American, British, French, Soviet zones. Originally, it was supposed to be a 3-piece pie, not a 4-piece pie. United States, Soviet Union, and Britain. It's Churchill and Roosevelt that want the French in on this. Stalin says no. In fact, in the summer, no, it was August, I believe it was, 1944, Charles de Gaulle went to visit Stalin. You know, de Gaulle is trying to put himself on that platform of being the new leader of a post-war France. This is almost like the whole story of Napoleon III in the early 1850s in France all over again, but it's now it's de Gaulle. And he has his meeting with Stalin, hoping to curry favor here. When he leaves, Vyacheslav Molotov says to Stalin, well, what do you think? Stalin, what do you mean, what do I think? The French are fools. They're losers. They got knocked off in 1940. That was brought up again at Yalta. Stalin will eventually concede to allow the French. But you know what he tells Churchill and Roosevelt? You want the French? Fine. But it comes out of your portions of Germany, not mine. And that's the deal he's going to make. That's the deal he's going to make. But now you have the beginnings of the Cold War. Now keep in mind here, Stalin was looking to move that border as far west as he could do so. He understands something that Putin understood when he took power. You know, which is why here the Normandy, the invasion, and not enough military historians qualify this, and I criticize them for this. Those guys who landed at Normandy, they didn't just serve Hitler as eviction notice. They won the first big battle of the Cold War, you know. If you don't want Hitler's replacement occupying Western Europe, you put troops there. This is hardcore cold logic. That's what you do. It's boots on the ground that wins the territory. And so that's what they're going to do. In fact, after the war was over with, Averell Harriman, the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, right after Berlin fell, attended a function here. And during this function, he proposed a toast. Well, you know, he's the ambassador. He's going to do things like this. And he proposed a toast that I want to congratulate the Soviet people for this great victory. I want to congratulate the Soviet army for their victory over the German army, and I want to congratulate Mr. Joseph Stalin here for his leadership. Now, what do you think Stalin should have said? Gee, thanks to the United States, to the British, whatever. No, he didn't. You know what he told Harriman? Tsar Alexander got to Paris, referencing Alexander I when Napoleon was defeated. I got to Berlin and Prague. Alexander got to Paris. Now keep in mind, if you're in Washington and London, you are going to be telling Churchill and Roosevelt, of course Roosevelt's dead by this point, it's Truman you're going to be talking to, that you have to make sure that the West stays, that France in particular here stays with the West, because you're going to tell them Italy had a sizable communist party. Well, who do you think killed Mussolini here? It was the communist guerrillas that killed him. France has a sizable communist party. Spain, even though it's Franco, sizable communist party. You know one thing in the post-war era here, actually in 1945, just after the war in Europe was over, when Ho Chi Minh didn't want the French coming back. He wanted the Chinese out and the British out. In fact, he thought he was going to get support from the French communists. You know what the French Communist Party did? They voted with the other parties to send troops back to Vietnam. How do you think? And remember your history here. Ho Chi Minh is one of the founders of the French Communist Party, 1920. Talk about getting it stuck to you. But what happened after the war here? The two big winners, you have a new balance of power. Everybody calls it the Cold War, but it's a new balance of power here. The British and the French empires, they're collapsing. They're collapsing. And so it's the Soviets and the United States. The lesser sent the Soviets because they got to dig out from the war here. This country, as mentioned earlier, will have 25 million dead. That's one of every 7 people who died in the Soviet Union. In fact, I have a study done here in 1944, and that show you how this really impacted this country. In 1940-41, there were 196.7 million people in the Soviet Union. For every 9 women, for every 10 women, there were 9.1 men. In 1945-46, for every 10 women, 6.5 men. 3/4 of those killed in the Great Patriotic War were men. Many of them in that age group 20 to 45. Aren't those the guys that regenerate the population? Aren't those the fellows who rebuild the roads, the bridges, the cities, so on and so forth? Correct, they are. And just so you know, in that period between June 22nd, 41 and May 7, 1945, 70,000 villages and towns had been wiped off the map in the Soviet Union. So some Americans here are beginning to think, well, we're facing a new Hitler. Stalin can't do it. He doesn't have the power. He's got to rebuild his country. Fortunately for the Soviets, a lot of their industry was in the Urals, beyond the range of the Luftwaffe. In fact, during that fateful summer and fall and getting into the winter, 1941, they are going to move 1,546 factories from Western Russia to the central area, to the Urals. You know how much of a monumental effort that is? And over 1,600,000 workers. Russians used to say it was like the earth had tilted and everything was rolling east. Everything was rolling east. But the United States is gearing up for the Cold War. Now, you could see where both countries are going here with the Soviets in 1946 and the United States in 1950. In 1946, the Soviet Union is now the second most powerful country on the world stage. And now Stalin was able to do what no one else was. They are on a world stage in the modern era. They have to act like they are. However, he assigns Andrei Zhdanov, one of his prized commissars, the man who was the commissar during the siege at Leningrad, by the way. He's an interesting man, Andrei Zhdanov. He will chair a committee here. Journalists, playwrights, actors, academics, students too. Anybody not on the same page with the new Soviet Union is blackballed. Now, he can't shoot a lot of people like he did in the 30s. He can't do that because now you can't hide it. Just like the Nazis, you can't hide it anymore. But in 1950, a committee will be formed here. It's called the McCarthy hearings. what was happening to actors, academics, playwrights, directors, people who were accused of being what? Card-carrying members of the Communist Party at one point in the 1930s. What happened to them? Blackballed, right? You see where both countries are going? You know, and I get questioned about this. Go back to the Marshall Plan, which Stalin is going to refuse. Why? Because he knows he'd have to be beholden to the dollar. The dollar is now the world's reserve currency. And like today, let's understand something here. American power is based on the supremacy of the dollar. Not a tank, not a carrier, not a jet plane. It's based on the dollar. In fact, right after the Yalta conference, if you recall, and I mentioned this in another talk, Roosevelt, before he died, met with Abdulaziz ibn Saud, and the two made the deal. U.S. military protection for the kingdom versus preferential access to Saudi crude, and every president, be he Democrat or Republican, has catered to this agenda ever since. Welcome to the Middle East. Your job here is number one, to make sure the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, and number two, make sure the resources go west, not east. That's your job. That's your job. And also, you are now the caretaker of the British Empire. But Stalin understands something that Putin understands now. We are not getting out of Eastern and Central Europe. Why? History says so. Let's take a look. 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. How did he get there? Poland and Ukraine. 1914, Germany invaded Russia. How did it get there? Poland and Ukraine. And let's not forget something. Poland had been wiped off the map by Catherine the Great by 1795, but now it's back in 1919 because the Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone. So they're resurrecting Poland. But the Poles are not satisfied with the territory they're getting, and so they invade Ukraine. And during the Russian the Civil War in Russia, it's Trotsky's Red Army that throws them back from Kiev. And let's understand something too. As the Poles were moving east, they were slaughtering Jewish people by the bushel. Now's our chance to get rid of our Jewish problem. So Trotsky's army throws them back. But on June 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union. How? Through Poland and Ukraine. You see a trend here? I do. I certainly do. And so it's not just Stalin. You think it's just Stalin? It's the Soviet people, the Russian people too. We've been through this a number of times. I mean, let's understand something here. And I get criticized for saying this in some of my talks, but if the United States Southwest had been invaded 3 times in 31 years, do you honestly think Mexico would be a sovereign state? Your border would be on the Guatemalan frontier. And we would probably have a new fast food chain here called Tortillas R Us. That's how big powers work. Remember what Stalin said in the book Our Conversations, written by Mia von Gies. We used to have, him and Tito had a lot of conversations with Stalin during the war. Stalin said, people spread their societies as far as their armies can reach. It can be no other way. The man is right. In fact, that's owing to, in a way, to Georg Hegel. Remember what the German philosopher said? War is change, peace is stagnation. Why do you think man doesn't get off that merry-go-round for? However, in today's world, you see the mistake that the West has made here. Why do you think Putin went into Ukraine? You think he's here just to take it? No, he's not. When you go back to when the Soviet Union collapsed, let's start with that, and it became an independent state. It also became the world's 3rd-ranking nuclear weapons power. That doesn't go well in Moscow, London, or Washington. And so they're gonna get together with Ukraine and have discussions. They're going to come up with by January 1994. They will have what's known as the Trilateral Agreement. The Trilateral Agreement was the beginning of Ukraine getting rid of its nuclear weapons. Now, how did they get these nuclear weapons? There were 30 Russian strategic bombers here, bear and backfire bombers, able to carry 415 nuclear bombs to the United States. Okay? And so those bombers will go back to Russia, the Russian Federation. The bombs will go back to the Russian Federation. But that's small potatoes here, because in the ground, missile silos, there are 136 SS-19 nuclear missiles, each with 6 warheads apiece. There are also 40 SS-24s rather, pardon me, each capable of carrying 10 warheads each. Those will go back to Russia. But what about the silos? Some were blown up, some were disassembled, others were filled with concrete and capped. The Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons. But on December 5, 1994, and this is critical here, the Budapest Memorandum, that's an interesting document to read, is signed by Ukraine, the United States, President Clinton, by the way, Britain, and Russia, the Russian Federation. They will sign this. Now, in this agreement is respect for Ukrainian neutrality, respect for Ukrainian political independence, respect for a free Ukraine. What's happened to Ukraine since 1994? Now, and again, I'll bring this up too. With Ukraine in the situation it's in, and they gave up their nuclear weapons, how do you think some smaller countries are going to think about nuclear weapons? And I'll give you a few. Israel, Iran, Pakistan, and let's not forget another one here, North Korea. All four know, and that includes Israel, all four know the signatures of the big powers on an agreement aren't worth the paper they're printed on. That's part of the problem you have here in Ukraine. You think the United States is here bringing democracy? Number one, I always have a problem with that word, because that word democracy is not in the United States Constitution. It was formed as a republic and not as a democracy. That to me is not even a starter here. We're here because of the resources. That's what we're here for. Trump isn't doing anything any different than Biden wouldn't have done. You know, talking about the precious metals. Well, in fact, already before Biden was out, how much money is it going to cost to fix Ukraine here? Hundreds of billions. Already, Bank of America, JP Morgan and Chase, and let's not forget Goldman Sachs here, Deutsche Bank, they're ready to front money here, but at what expense? Maybe the phosphates, the fertilizers, the wheat, precious metals, the resources. That's what they want. So are Ukrainians going to own their own country when this is over with? I mean, let's be real here, right? This is what you see as part of that aftermath of what happened here in 1945. The decline of the Europeans as the determinants of power is cataclysmic. Of course, this really begins in 1914 and finishes in 1945, man's greatest industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. And I'll leave you with Lenin. Lenin said, before 1914, the next European war will not be one of those short, sharp conflicts between the monarchs for a little strip of land. It's going to be a long war. It's going to be a war waged by the capitalist, fought by the working class. Is he wrong? No, he's not. And another man in the United States warned about this in 1898. His name is Albert Beveridge. He was a senator in Indiana about the time of the Spanish-American War. America's introduction here as an imperialist power outside our borders. He said, he's an interesting man to get to know, Albert Beveridge. Whoever thinks that governments do not control price ought to ask themselves, why are the British still in South Africa, Egypt, and India? He's telling you that this free market message works on Main Street, you know, with barbershops, convenience stores, gas stations, maybe, so on and so forth. But whoever controls the steel, the iron, the gold, the silver, later on oil, gas, they control the price. And he warned, from here on in, the wars among the great powers will be fought for resources and strategic position. The great game. And that's what you're seeing played now. Hasn't changed. Only one more point. You are no longer in the Industrial Revolution. You are now in the technology revolution. Interesting. What a world. If anybody has any questions or observations or comments.
Thank you so much, Mark. Please, whoever wants to join the discussion, raise your hand, and I'll try to call on people in order. Before that, we need to just say a little bit about our programs coming up. And does someone from the planning committee want to say something about that? Oh, well, next week, I can talk about next week. Raj, who's here today, is going to speak about the nation state in South Asia in the era of capitalist decline. And this is very important, and the role of nationalism, it will be at the forefront of Raj's discussion. Raj, did you want to say anything more about?
No, I think you described it well.
Okay, and then we're working on programs after that, so tune in again. Does anyone want to speak about our need for funding? We do have expenses. We have a website, and we have the expenses of making sure that these recorded programs are on YouTube. And so if you would like to help us, you can click on Buy Me a Coffee on our website and either give us a one-time donation or sign up for regular donations. Or you can contact us if you'd rather send a check. We're open to that, even though it's not popular these days. So I'm just going to look at the stack and call on people in order. So the first is going to be Raj, followed by Mike H., followed by Kit. Raj, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mark, thank you. It was very exciting. I like your style as also your materialist approach to history. So I enjoyed your talk a great deal. I wanted to
Thank you, Raj.
I want to tell you that on Stalin going away and losing his head and not speaking and so forth, that's not corroborated by Molotov. I don't know if Molotov is lying, but in his book, he was asked this question. The question was, it is written that he lost his head and lost the ability to speak in the first days of the war. I'm just quoting from the book. That
Right.
book is Molotov Remembers. And so Molotov response was, I wouldn't say he lost his head. He suffered, but he didn't show any signs of this. Undoubtedly, he had his rough moments. It's nonsense to say he didn't suffer, but he's not portrayed as he really was. They show him as a repenting sinner. Well, that's absurd, of course. As usual, he worked day and night and never lost his head or his gift of speech. So the person follows up. He says, how was he behaving? Molotov says, how did he comport himself? As Stalin was supposed to, firmly. Uh, so he said, Stalin did say, we blew it. And he was referring to all of us. It means surprise attack, that we were not prepared at the front. And there were reasons for not taking the first move. This book that he has written, Stalin's Wars, the Scottish historian, he also says, I'm not going to quote from there, but the point was, for Stalin, it was very important not to be seen as aggressor because he was afraid that the Western imperialist countries would line up behind Hitler because they were all imperialists. So he wanted to make sure that
2 minutes.
yeah, okay, that's it. So that's just wanted to say that when you got that from some book, I think it's written by many people. Molotov
There-
didn't agree with it. So you can
Yeah, well, in those meetings, he railed and yelled at everyone at that meeting. He said, we screwed up what Lenin started.
well, he
Now,
said for everybody, including himself. He wasn't.
correct,
Yeah,
but he did lose his focus. He'll regain it, but he lost his focus. At the same time, though, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov tried to tell him, you've got too many troops up in the front line against a potential German attack. You need to move back the armor. So if the Germans do attack us, we have the armor to launch a counterattack and throw them back. Stalin said no. Now, let's understand something about Stalin. He's going to learn as they go along here, because again, the proof's in the pudding here. After the first part of the war, June 22nd, 41, till the end of February, you know how many men the Soviets are going to lose in the battlefield? 2 million. 4 million were taken prisoner. And by the end of February, 2,500,000 of those are dead. But what they're going to do is, and it sells the fiction to Hitler on the way to Stalingrad, Stalin's letting the men fall back. And Hitler has sold that fiction. Gee, they must be running out of men. We're not capturing as many anymore. So Stalin is learning as they go along. And by the end of the war, he had a pretty good handle on this. Why? It was that was an education and process.
This question, is that from Zhukov's book?
Yes.
Okay,
That's
now
from
it's a
Zhukov's
little bit
book.
self-serving too, so we should take it with a
Correct. But even other Russian generals were saying that, Stalin was learning as they went along. And that is a learning curve. I mean, Mao said the same thing. Anybody can learn war. You don't have to go to West Point or Sandhurst. Is there a learning curve here? Yes, there is. And
Okay.
Stalin's going to have to take that learning curve.
I agree with you there. I mean, these big losses, Stalin has to take some blame on it. No
Well, of
question.
course. But they're learning from the Germans as they go along here. And I'm going to tell you something. By 1944, and I've said this in other talks, if I wanted an army by 1944, it would be the Soviet army. You know why? Because by 1944, Raj, this, as an army, this is the world's most lethal killing machine. And that's exactly what it was. That's exactly what it was. Interesting.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Next is Mike H., followed by Kit, followed by Jean. Mike, please unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, am I unmuted yet?
Yes, yes, we can hear
Yeah,
you.
I kept hitting the unmute and it wouldn't let me unmute.
Yeah,
So
good day, Mike.
my question is, in the 2 years before the Great Patriotic War, from the invasion of Poland in October of 1939 until the start of the Great Patriotic War, that's kind of like a big black hole in my memory. I just don't understand what the Soviets were doing for 2 years. Were they, I don't know, starting to build their productive capacity, or what were they doing for those 2 years before the start of the Great Patriotic War?
Well, they had joined the League of Nations in 1934. That was Maxim Litvinov's idea. He was the foreign minister then, because he believed in collective security with the British and the French to rein in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And with with what happened in Europe leading to 39, Stalin said collective security isn't working too well, so he fires Litvinov and brings in Vyacheslav Molotov. But he will make a deal with Hitler. In fact, I wrote an article on this of 5,500 words in World War II History magazine. And I really enjoyed writing this article about the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And this pact was consummated by Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, and Vyacheslav Molotov. And it was signed by the two of them in the Kremlin on the night of August 23, 24, 2:30 in the morning, 1939. And in this pact to the world, this is, well, the Germans will sell finished goods to the Soviet Union, and raw materials will go to Germany. But no, that's the icing. The cake here is, as you were intimating here, Poland. And so on September 1, 1939, Hitler will invade Western Poland. And on September 17, 1939, the Red Army will overflow the eastern borders of Poland and move the Soviet border further west. That's what Stalin wants. That's what he wants. So they divided Poland up. So Hitler couldn't do anything without Stalin's connivance here. But Stalin is moving the border west. He doesn't trust Hitler either, even though now they are signers of an agreement here. So, but then again, the Soviets, except for the Winter War, when they invaded parts of Finland, November 30, 1939, really aren't in the fighting here until June 22nd, 41.
So their industrial production was not ramped up until after June of 1941?
Well, no, before then. In fact, Mike, you might find this interesting. You know, one of the things that Stalin concentrated on was making tractors. When he industrialized this country, he focused on heavy industries, tractors, machine tools, that kind of thing. You know, he's not stupid, Mike. He knows the Soviet Union, like the United States, is swimming in oil. So why should the farmers and peasants be plowing their fields with horses and mules? Can't you produce more food with tractors? Yeah, of course you can. Yet, what can you convert tractor factories into making during a war? Tanks. You see where he's going? In fact, by 1941, in fact, I've got records here for this. There were, among all the major powers in the world, 40,000 tanks in the world. 40,000. The Soviets had 22,700 of them. Note that, 22,700 of them. But they didn't use them right. They lost 17,000 of them by the Battle of Moscow. But again, they're going to learn. But it's a good thing they had that industrial capacity. Of course, the tanks they lost were tanks they were first making. They're junks. But they'll learn. They had a steep learning curve here, and they will learn. They will learn. You got to give them credit for that.
Okay, next is Kit, followed by Jean.
Yes, thank you, Mark, for speaking. You're always exciting to hear. It's like
Oh, good
listening
day. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good.
You're like listening to a movie, which is really, really fun. My question has to do with the technology, because that's what we are going through right now, this whole transition. And the unfortunate side about the advancement of technology is that war motivates or promotes that.
Yep.
We know that trillions of dollars, our tax dollars are being invested in advanced technology, and that the war in Ukraine was also fought with advanced technology. Can you comment on the three powers, China, Russia, we in the U.S. about where we are at with this advanced technology, where you think it's going? Will our wars be fought by drones, in space, etc.?
Yeah, you remember when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House?
Oh yeah.
Remember when she went to Taiwan?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you don't think that was a social call, do you?
No, not at all.
She knows, she's not stupid. She knows that 50, and in fact, we discussed this where I work, 53% of the computer chips used by the Defense Department come from Taiwan. Now, she's intimating to the Taiwanese here, why don't you move your chip production to the United States, or some of it? Because that goes along with, at one point, what Biden will call the Build Back Better program. He thought about making Ohio the chip producing capital of the United States. Now that makes sense. What happened to the automobile industry here? But what do you think China said about this? You think they were happy about this? No, of course not. Of course not. Computer chips kit must be seen as a resource like oil, gas, gold, silver. It's got to be considered a resource, because can you drive your car or operate your phone or your computer without chips? Well, how do you think some of these weapons are used by chips? China is interesting here because they're making sure that the Russians get the chips. They're making sure Russians get chips. Keep in mind, you remember when the United States, this thing with the technology is fascinating. Yes, drones, you're not expending a pilot, you're expending a piece of machinery, drones. You're no longer seeing, like in World War II kit, 500, 700, 1,000 bombers ranging over a city dropping fire bombs. You're no longer seeing that. You are seeing dozens of drones, maybe 100 drones, maybe 200 drones being launched, but there's no pilot, not in the drone. But it's still air power of a sort, right? You're seeing that. But you didn't need chips in a B-17. You need chips in what you're doing now. Now, interesting here too, if you recall, and I'll add this, you remember when the United States put sanctions on Russia for the invasion of Ukraine?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because the ruble is not a strong currency, is it? Not like the dollar or the pound or the Swiss franc. But you know who backs the ruble? The Shanghai Gold Exchange. That's why there's food in the grocery stores in Russia. There are goods in the department stores. People are still getting paid every week. Retirees are getting their checks every month. So the sanctions have not worked to the extent that the United States thought they were going to work. So it's economics and, yes, technology. Like I said earlier, you're now in the technology era. You're no longer in that industrial revolution anymore. It's the technology revolution. And you're seeing that in Ukraine. You're also seeing it in Palestine.
Mm.
You're seeing it there too.
Yeah. Well, you think the U.S. should go back to the gold standard?
We don't have enough gold to print all the money. The money has to be pegged to a certain amount of gold here, and I don't think you have enough gold and silver for that. So that money is based on your full faith in the United States government. How's that working for you?
Not great.
No, of course not.
Thank you. Next is Jean, followed by Richard and Citizen. Go ahead, Jean.
Hello, Jim.
Okay, Mark, great talk. Thank you so much. And really, clarified a lot of points. Let me just say, first of all, I'm wearing my Veterans for Peace cap, and Veterans for Peace, is, some people here know, is an organization dedicated to the abolishment of war. And
Right.
In order to do that, of course, we need to study war, just
Right.
like you need to study cancer if you want to abolish cancer. But a couple of points. One is, I don't think you mentioned the Bandera Brigade, the group of basically Ukrainians that fought on the side of the Nazis, which
Correct.
it's something that needs to be
Correct.
borne in mind. But also, latest news out of what's going on in Ukraine right now, they kind of see Zelensky as the apostle of freedom and democracy, and Putin and the Russians as the bad guys. And I
Right.
have a lot of trouble swallowing that. And I just want to know if you have any comments on what do you think about all that. But again, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, is Putin an autocrat? Yeah. Is he totally wrong here? No. Is the United States wrong here? Yes. I mean, go back to what I mentioned before about the Budapest Memorandum. They all signed that agreement to respect Ukrainian territorial integrity and respect their form of government. How's that worked out? It hasn't. The big powers don't care. They want the resources. That's basically the game here. But again, from Russia's point of view, I mean, if we were Russians, you don't think something. In fact, did you hear the other day that the Stalin is becoming more popular again here? Interesting. He represented order.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he did. He represented order. But at the same time here, Gene, the United States is hardly squeaky clean here. Remember what Victoria Nuland did here in 2014? That's no accident, Jane. That is no accident. I mean, what did we do to Mossadegh? What did we do in Guatemala in 1954? What happened to Lumumba? You don't see a trend here? I do. We haven't got, and it doesn't matter who if it's a Democrat or Republican. We're doing the same sort of thing since 1945. We haven't broken this trend yet. The big thing here is to maintain the dollar. Now, I don't want to give you cause for concern here, but 50 years ago, the dollar represented anywhere from upwards of 75% of transactions in the world. Now it's 58%. That's happening. You're witnessing this. In fact, you couldn't have the worst man in the White House to try to bring America back, because where is he going with it? It's declining. He's accelerated the descent. So whenever I hear him talking about Putin, he couldn't sit at the same negotiating table with Putin, because Putin will eat him alive. It would have been worse if Stalin was at that table. I mean, Stalin, there's one thing I'll say about Stalin. There was just something about him. And I always tell people, I understand why they're interested in Churchill, Roosevelt, Mussolini, and Hitler. But I tell people, if you consider Stalin second rate, you're missing something. He was arguably one of the most interesting of that group. Stalin is. He's a fascinating study. I mean, Stalin's revolution was that industrialization of the Soviet Union that made it the power it will become after 45. If he didn't industrialize this, they were sunk. He wasn't stupid. He knew the Versailles Treaty is the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man. He knew this. And he knew that Russia was not ready for 1914. So what's the attitude here with Stalin? Not my watch. We're going to be ready. Well, they weren't quite ready. That's partly his fault. I'll give you that. But at the same time, they were able to survive, and they're the ones who beat the German army, not the West. They did that fight, and they did this largely on their own. Largely on their own. And they're going to pay for this. Big time. Big time. In fact, I teach a course called The Great Patriotic War. It's the only course, Gene, I've taught where every once in a while I would get somebody at the end of that course, it looks like they've had PTSD. They can't believe what they're hearing here. It's the losses that stagger them. It's the losses that stagger them. There's just nothing that can compare to this in the 20th century, like the Eastern Front. It's in a class by itself. When I talk World War II, I always say this is in a class by itself. It truly is. It truly was. There is nothing like it. Not in the 20. I mean, you can compare the Western Front maybe in France to this a bit, or what some of those Marines and GIs went through on those islands in the Pacific. But it's the size and the scope here on the Eastern Front. That's what makes it, the size and the scope. It's a huge, huge battlefield. And the Germans, quite frankly, didn't have enough men for it in the end. And they're going to lose 5 million dead here, besides the 25 million the Soviets lost. In fact, go to Germany, go to the military cemeteries, and what are you going to see? Gefallen Kursk, Gefallen Stalingrad, Gefallen Moscow, Gefallen Lenin. 80% of the German dead here, soldiers, were killed on the Eastern Front. So who won the war? Who won the land war? The Soviets did. But they paid for it. They paid for it. But they're Russians. They're used to paying. Which, to me, I don't know if Americans would be willing to do that. That's just
Thank
a
you.
comment I'm making.
Thank you.
I feel like I have PTSD for having lived most of my life during the Cold War and the American War in Vietnam. Richard, and then followed by Citizen of the Planet. Go ahead, Richard.
Hey, Richard.
There we go. Got to unmute. Hi, Mark. Thank you for your exploration of the Great Patriotic War. I had a couple.
And we just scratched the surface.
I know. I understand that. I'm going to approach that. I'm going to get into that a little bit. First off, have you seen? I posted this in the ICSS chat. I think the last time or the time before this. There's a chart by G0. It's called. Are you familiar with this? If not, I'll email it to you.
Yeah. In fact, for those who have any afterthoughts, I put my email addresses in the chat.
If you haven't seen it, it's actually a pretty good chart of World War II, of civilian and military casualties by country. It's really, I'll forward it to you.
Yeah, do so.
Okay, so what I wanted to get into a little bit here was what was going on before the invasion of the Soviet Union. One was that I think I read somewhere in the last couple of weeks that prior to the invasion, that dragon's teeth and barricades were set up along the western border. I get the to help ameliorate or delay the German advance.
Right.
I mean, is there any truth? One, is there any truth to that? The other thing is that what, as I recall, there were negotiations. The Soviets approached both Roosevelt and Churchill, I believe, or maybe even about that they were aware that they were very suspicious of the Germans' intents, and they approached them early on for aid, and they were rejected with something like the comment being, "Let the Germans and Russians fight it out. It's all to our advantage." Are you can you comment on that a little bit? And
Yeah, in
2
fact,
minutes.
in fact, because of the Germans were breaking the Enigma code, they warned Stalin that Hitler was coming. The United States with the magic, the purple code, they warned. Roosevelt will warn Stalin too that Hitler was coming. But let's understand something with the Japanese. That was not a military code they were breaking. That was a diplomatic code. I've been asked many times, well, they should have been better prepared at Pearl Harbor. Yes, but I have yet to find, and I've looked, for that document. Well, we're coming. I don't find that, but they should have been better prepared. Stalin too, but Stalin will say, because Zhukov, Shaposhnikov, said, well, they're warning us, and Stalin said, whenever the West tells you one thing, you do the opposite.
yeah.
They would like nothing better than to see Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union go to war, and then they'll just march in after it's all over with. That's what he said. But I think besides that, to me, the big mistake was, I think Zhukov was right. He should have moved the armor back 200 or 300 miles from the front, and then left infantry units up front to slow them down, and then he could throw the Germans back with armor. But he didn't do that. He kept everybody up near the front. So I think that's because Hitler, he was urged to go to Moscow right away. He didn't want to do that. He said Napoleon took Moscow, but lost it. What Hitler wanted to do is section off, as he advanced into 150, 200 miles deep, pockets of the large Soviet army, and then liquidate those pockets. That army won't be around tomorrow. In fact, they were, as far as Minsk, they were almost 2/3 the way inside the Soviet Union. Richard, they had 4 huge pockets. They had 8 armored divisions and 32 infantry divisions surrounded. There's one problem with this. As the Germans are surrounding these pockets with armor, because they needed the horse to make up for the lack of trucks, they didn't have enough infantry to fill in the holes that the armor left. So there are Soviet troops escaping east. And so is that going to help cost them? Yes. Although they still captured by February 42, 4 million Soviets. 4 million. But that's going to change after this.
If I could just interrupt you real quick, Mark. I mean, it's interesting that the German tactics are basically the tactics that the Russians are employing today in Ukraine, and that is,
right,
divide, go in there and divide up and hit them on flanks,
right?
And and it seems to be working very, very, very well.
Well, the post-war era, once the Warsaw Pact is formed, if you read Soviet military doctrine, you'll find volumes based off of what happened on the Eastern Front. Mobile warfare. The Soviets called it deep penetration, deep battle. They knew they weren't going to win the battle. They knew they weren't going to win the war in one battle, but you destroy large pockets of an enemy army here, recoup, and then launch another attack. But you go deep behind the enemy lines and destroy what you've surrounded.
Isn't that sort of like, well, okay, I've done my time. I'll shut up. I'm sorry.
Okay. Citizen of the Planet, followed by Roger, followed by Hazel. Go ahead, citizen.
Okay, yeah. First, a couple of comments before my question.
Good afternoon. Good day.
Yeah, hello. Yes, Sharon Rose, I certainly identify with what you said about PTSD with regard to the genocidal Vietnam War. I sort of feel a moral helplessness about this genocidal US-backed genocide that Israel has been engaged in. And
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes, and I often wonder what young people who are growing up under this kind of foreign policy, how they will be able to deal with it in the future. My other question regards blowback. I'm sorry, my other comment before my question regards blowback. You know, I sort of see that if the U.S. hadn't militarily intervened in World War I, a war in which there were no good guys, that I think there probably would have been no World War II. I think had Hitler not been a racial genocidal megalomaniac, and had not the fascists in Japan not been genocidal maniacs, I think you could view both wars in a way as, certainly Japan, as defensive wars, with, you know, the US and European countries having militarily attacked Japan to open its markets. And I don't think that Japan ever intended on defeating the continental US, just buying itself time to get the Europeans out of Asia. And I think, you know, World War II, Woodrow Wilson, the very racist so-called father of democracy, warned Britain and France that if you were too harsh on Germany, there's going to be problems in the future. And had the Nazis not been racist, genocidal people, it would have just been another European war. So those are my two observations about that. My question is, I certainly don't pretend to be an expert or even well-versed on Stalin. And perhaps because of that, I wonder if American leftists don't often romanticize certain leaders or leftist leaders or countries like China, which doesn't have any national elections.
Past 2 minutes, but continue
I'll
with the
wrap right up.
question.
Yeah, I'll wrap right up. Doesn't have national elections, not something we would accept, or perhaps romanticize Stalin. I certainly don't think China or Russia should be vilified, on the other hand. So my question is, what do you have to say about Khrushchev's renunciation of Stalin? Thank you.
Well, let's, you know, Khrushchev is interesting because when Stalin began that program of industrialization in 1927, after the 1926 Party Congress, that's where he announced it, and that's what he was going to do, and he did it. There were many members of the party, like Grigory Zinoviev, Mikhail Tomsky, people like this, who weren't totally on board. And these are the guys he came up with Lenin. Well, he's going to get rid of a lot of these guys in the purges. However, he's going to bring new blood in who will conform to this agenda of his. People like Leonid Brezhnev, remember him? Alexei Kosygin, Nikita Khrushchev. This is the new blood. But of course, again, Khrushchev was actually later elevated to the political commissar of Ukraine. And I remember him seeing at the Battle of Stalingrad, going to see Vasily Chuikov, the commander of the 62nd Army, when the Germans had captured 90% of Stalingrad at this point. And he says to Chuikov, he says, I hope you understand what's going to happen to both of us if you don't hold here. And he's not talking about the Germans. He's talking about Stalin. And Chuikov says, I don't need a reminder. Yet, when the war is over with, he is eventually going to be the winner of that, we'll call it debate, to be Stalin's heir. And so he's looking for, if you remember, to open up relations with the West to get Western technology, which was not a bad idea from the West. So he's going to vilify Stalin, is what he's going to do. And he's going to bring back Georgy Zhukov, who was reduced by Stalin because he was a big hero during the war. He saw Zhukov as a threat. You know, all leaders do this. I mean, if you take a look at Hitler, you know, he's going to decapitate the SA because he thought Ernst Röhm was a threat. You know, this is what some of these dictators do. And so, is Stalin any different? No. Is Khrushchev any different after Stalin's dead? No, he's going to vilify him. He's got to build up, he's got to pat his own nest here. Although, let's understand something. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, guess what's going to happen to him in 1964? Brezhnev and Kosygin will take control of the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev is dethroned. He can go to his dacha, he gets his retirement, but keep your mouth shut. And so, like he vilified Stalin, he's going to get vilified too. Interesting how these things go along. They don't really change here, you know. And it doesn't matter what country it is. What does Trump always say about Biden lately? You know, he's got to paint him as an idiot, bad guy, whatever the case may be. And then the next president will call Trump the same thing. I mean, it doesn't stop. It's like watching professional wrestling.
I just want to briefly say, first, thank you for your very interesting answer. And second, I wanted to add, you know, the U.S. didn't militarily intervene in World War I for any moral reasons, but for economic reasons. And I believe had the U.S. not intervened, there would have been a more equitable settlement of World War I, because it essentially would have been a stalemate. And as I said, there wouldn't have been the harsh sanctions against Germany that I believe led to World War II. So I guess I'll just, finally, U.S. never, and the Allies didn't make that mistake again after World War II with regard to Germany or Japan. Thank you.
Well, the Japanese, let me just finish up. The Japanese were saying at the end of the 19th century, Asia for Asians, let's kick out the white Christian colonial powers. That will be an essence of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In other words, the Japanese Empire. All coming out of this thing known as Haku Ichu. We're going to bring the 8 corners of the world under a single roof, a Japanese roof. The Japanese here, and I said this at a talk the other night, by the way. You take a look at Haku Ichu, Manifest Destiny, Dragnak Osten, Lebensraum, and Zionism. They're all cut out of the same cloth.
Yes.
It's just that different people label it in a different fashion, but it's basically the same sort of thing. You're taking land from your neighbor for whatever you need to use it, whether it be the resources, whether it's strategic position. This is all part of the great game, for crying out loud. Mission Civil Estris, that which is another false statement here. We're bringing a civilization to the downtrodden. A lot of garbage this is.
Yes.
It hasn't stopped. It's the same sort of thing.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to call on Roger, followed by Hazel. Go ahead, Roger.
Okay, well,
Hey,
thank you.
Roger.
Hi, how are you doing? Mark, really appreciate your talk. I'm always impressed, not only by your grasp of the particulars and the fine grain, but also your ability to synthesize that into the very large picture. So I
Well,
really
I'm
do
having a lot of
appreciate
fun
that.
here.
But in your talk, you spoke about the origins of the Cold War, and you spoke about that. And I was wondering if you could elaborate, like, to what extent did the Cold War start before the armistice itself? How was that going on, where both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were fighting on the same side, yet they were working to a future where they'd be on the other side of the barricades from each other? And if you want to comment more about how that's carried forward to the present, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I would. You know, if I'm under the impression here that if Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't die on April 12, 1945, what people called the Cold War would have been somewhat warmer. I think Roosevelt knew what he had with Stalin. Stalin certainly knew what he had with Roosevelt, because Churchill is playing a losing hand here. Even at Yalta, this was noticed. Having said that, you know, and Stalin got his way with the 4 pie setup with Germany. You know, you want France in here, then you'll have to take it out of your territory allotted to you for Germany, not mine. But when Roosevelt dies, and for a Stalin, you have continuity here, and you have predictability with Roosevelt. You don't have predictability here with Truman. He doesn't know who Truman is. And I'm under the impression here that he got along with a man from America's royalty as president, then he's going to get along with a guy who was a product of a haberdasher. Truman is more the common man approach. He speaks the same way, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work well. But at the same time here, you have developing here, people like George Kennan, who I think is one of the most astute foreign policy experts this country ever had, and he knew Russia. He said, in fact, he's a co-author of the Marshall Plan. Now, why do you have the Marshall Plan? You think we did this because we're nice people? We did this because we got 15 million out of 16 million men coming out of a uniform, and you darn well better sure have a job for them, or else you train them to kill, right? So we're going to resurrect, with the Marshall Plan, we're going to resurrect Western Europe and Japan as dumping grounds for American goods. This is mercantilism of a form. This is what we're doing. And that the GI Bill will build the American middle class. But at the same time, one of the men who co-wrote this is George Kennan. George Kennan was the State Department policy planner. And you know what he's going to say in 1948? I've got this 19-page printout in my files. And one of the things he says here, that in 1948, we have 6.5% of the world's population. We control 50% of the world's resources. You don't think, he says, we are going to be the butt of envy and resentment. You don't think that's not true? If you're number one, don't people want to knock you off? I mean, I gave a talk 2 weeks ago and I had to bring this up. I said, what happens to Boston Red Sox fans every time the Yankees win the World Series? They get ticked off. And so it's the same thing. But he also states, since we are the number one power, we ought to cease these nonsensical notions of spreading democratization and raising other people's living standards. You're now a great power. Act like one. And that's exactly where this country's going to go. Exactly where this country's going to go. And in fact, he was against NATO. He says you don't want to put together a NATO because the Soviets are going to do the same thing. What did the Soviets come out with in 1953? The Warsaw Pact. Again, Kennan understood that Stalin was no new Hitler. He knew the Soviets couldn't do it. The Germans bashed them up. So why are we going to go into all of this militarization? That was Kennan. Don't trust the Soviets, but don't antagonize them. That was Kennan. In fact, he'll tell Bill Clinton, don't spread NATO in Eastern Europe. You're asking for a world of trouble. What do we have right now? A world of trouble. So it's people like that. Somebody asked me the other night, do you read Thomas Friedman, the New York Times? I said, no. Well, who do you read? Zbigniew Brzezinski, George Kennan, Halford Mackinder, the ace policymaker for Britain from the late 19th century into the 20th, Nicholas Spickman, who used to teach at Yale and the University of Chicago. These are the people I read. If I really want to understand foreign policy over a long period of time, because Roger, that man does what? He repeats. He repeats. That's what these historians bring to the table, and maybe somebody like a journalist like Friedman is not. Man does, it's not exact, but man repeats. In fact, that one question Citizen of Planet One brought up, that's along the same lines that he's saying here. History repeats. And so we make the same mistakes over and over and over again. In fact, my Rosemary was telling me the other day, she says, gee, you ever think we'll get off that merry-go-round? I said, if we do, I said, I'm out of a job.
Okay, next is Hazel.
Thank you. I really appreciated your talk in general. I thought it was particularly helpful.
Thank you, Hazel.
Lining up dates with, like, for example, the Tehran meeting, to like contextualize some of the like geopolitical intentions and decisions on board there. Yeah, I guess like so my question is, fascism as I understand it, right, can be defined kind of broadly as like, I think Dimitrov says like the most, the open dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of finance capital, right? And I, know a little bit about how this comes into play, both in World War II, right, and like currently with, for example, plans not just to colonize Gaza, but to develop it, right? And I guess I was wondering if it's within the scope of this conversation, right, if you could elucidate a little more, like what, I think you mentioned like, the sale of Finnish iron to the Nazis, right, what have you. But if you could elucidate a little more, like beyond just, well, they were recouping from financial losses during World War I, how did, the needs of finance capital leading up to and during World War II influence like the, if not the moment-to-moment tactics and like broader military strategy for the fascists?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you were in school, you were probably told on April 6th, I know I was, on April 6, 1917, Woodrow Wilson got the declaration of war he asked Congress for on April 2nd. Now, part of this is, and there's truth to this, it's not like there isn't, there's truth to this. He had warned the Germans a number of times about unrestricted submarine warfare. That's not accepted then. That's not accepted then. You're sinking ships without warning. It will be accepted World War II, but it wasn't quite accepted then. There's truth to that, and I will concede that point. The other one, though, Hazel, is this war was so expensive. The British and the French are liquidating investments and assets in this country to pay for it, and they still can't afford it. In fact, J.P. Morgan, remember him? The Morgan interest, the banking interest here, cannot keep up. Get this, the Morgans can't keep up with the financial demands of the Allies here. Do you know in the middle of 1916, the British are $800 million. They have investment paper here that they're going to have to pay back. And then by December the same year, it's 1.6 billion. Can you imagine this? And so, interesting, Hazel, once we get into the war, and it's even brought up to Woodrow Wilson that if we don't get into this war, we might, and the Allies can't pay, then we might have a recession or depression in this country. And so and you know how much they're going to owe us when the war is over with? These figures were unheard of at the time. Unheard of. The Allies are going to owe us $11.5 billion. Imagine that. And that's when the dollar bought something. $11.5 billion. Do you know what's going to cost? That war is going to cost this country $2 million an hour? $2 million an hour. And this government's going to spend over $22 billion for the short time we're in this war. Believe it or not, Hazel, that's more money than the federal government spent from 1791 to 1914. We are in uncharted territory here. Uncharted. And on top of that, if the Allies are going to owe us that money back, Hazel, and Germany has to pay the Allies $33 billion after the war with a busted economy, how's that working? So what are we going to do? We are going to invest in Germany. We're going to put the dollar into Germany, buy German bonds, invest in companies, and as they pay back the Allies the $33 billion according to the Versailles Treaty, they will begin to pay us back. That's how it's going to have to work. But again, though, interesting, that's not just the money, Hazel. In what we call World War I, they came up with something known as the War Industries Board. You ever hear of this? Bernard Baruch was the economic czar here. Note the term economic czar. And you know what the War Industries Board did? If you owned a company, let's say you make widgets, right? And you make widgets according to the orders put in by your clients. That's not how this is working anymore. The federal government says to you, we need so many widgets from you, and we need them such and such a date so they can go to France on the Western Front and be used. They will be picked up by the transportation companies, all of which now are overseen by Washington. They will be sent to the docks. They will be put on the boats of the shipping companies, which are now overseen by Washington. You see what happened here? What happened to free market, Hazel? That's the beginnings of a corporate fascist state, as Mussolini will say in 1927. The essence of a corporate fascist state is that large corporations and financial institutions run the economy. What happened to small and medium-sized business here? That's the essence of a corporate fascist state, which I have arguments with some people even today. We are the basic definition of a corporate fascist state going on decades. Forget Trump. Forget Trump. You know, you take a look at your economy. How many big oil companies you got now? How many big airlines you got now? How many big railroads you got now? How many big insurance companies you got now? You see what I'm saying here? They run their industries. That's what Mussolini was putting together. The big companies run their industries. And if you want to add insult to injury here, that was the essence of the National Recovery Act of 1933, 1934. You see what's happened here? What happened to free market capitalism? They like to talk about. What happened to that? Does it really exist? You say. I say it doesn't.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to call on myself, followed by Daniel. So a comment and a question. So I believe that the victory, that the demise of the Soviet Union represents the final victory of Nazism over the Soviet Union for two reasons. First of all, they lost their best cadre. Among those 30 million people, their very best cadre. Mm. And they never recovered from that. And
I agree.
And secondly, they were forced to build atomic bombs and have a huge military industry by the United States, which dropped not one, but two atomic bombs on the people of Japan as a warning to the Soviet Union. And so my question has to do, getting back to what you said about Roosevelt. Of course, we can speculate all day about what might have happened, but
right.
The fact that he died in April and Truman became vice president, by the way, you didn't say what is really key about Truman's politics is that he was a member of the KKK.
Right.
And that Roosevelt made that happen by ditching Wallace as his vice president. So are you saying that Roosevelt would not have dropped those atomic bombs?
Oh, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I'm giving talks on the atomic bombs in July and August. The two battles that really figure here are Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And those battles, they had 35% casualties. And Truman knows, and he's to a certain extent right here, the American public is not going to put up with casualties like that on the Japanese home islands. Let's keep in mind something here. The Japanese had 5,000 kamikaze planes waiting with 7,000 more in reserve. They took all their 4 million civilians who work for the Army and Navy, and they're going to arm them. They had the Japanese People's Volunteer Corps, all women 17 to 45, men 16 to 65, will be armed with bird guns, bows and arrows, punji stakes, whatever it took. And that's what was waiting for GIs when they, or Marines and so on and so forth, when they land here. However, having said that, it's the militarists in Japan who did not want to surrender. They wanted one big giant seppuku is what they wanted here. My take on this is that Hirohito waited too long. He should have put his foot down earlier, and he didn't. He didn't. And to me, that's an issue. At the same time here, Truman's not stupid. He knows it was agreed to at Yalta that between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, that 3 months after the Germans surrender, the Soviets will get involved in the war in the Pacific. Now, understand, now, let's add to this, go back to what I mentioned about Germany. It was divided into a pie of 4 parts. If you remember, after the bombs were dropped, the war in the Pacific is over, the United States will not allow anyone else in Japan except itself. That is no accident. You know, we learned quick. We're not going to share Japan like they share. And you know who got angry? The Australians. We fought here too, you know. You're not going to be allowed in. We told them to get out. Interesting.
And the Philippines.
And the Philippines, right. And so interesting when you take and you step back and look at this overall picture, the politics being played here with the bombs. With the bombs.
But why did Truman didn't have to drop the second one?
He said, you know, they with that one, it's Hirohito again. We have to give up. And he ordered the big 6, those are the high-ranking military commanders led by a General Umezu, to have a meeting real quick and give up. You know when they planned the meeting? August 9. They waited again too long, and they dropped the second bomb. Of course, that same morning, that's when Stalin invaded Manchuria.
Right.
This is not a good day for Japan at all.
Well, the Japanese were already being pushed out of Manchuria by the Chinese.
Right. But the Soviets come in. And Stalin kept his word, just like he did on June 22nd, 44, when he to take the pressure off the West, he launched Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front. He kept his word here. Of course, he's going to looking to get something out of it. I'll agree to that. But at the same time, he kept his word. But we don't want him. Of course, nobody knows about communist China yet. Nobody knows Mao's going to win the Civil War. Nobody knows that yet. But we don't want the Soviet Union staying in Manchuria and maybe even taking Korea. Hence, the United States is not getting out of Japan. Yet the fly in the ointment is going to be 1949 when Mao beats Chiang Kai-shek. Now that changes everything here.
Actually, Mao offered Chiang Kai-shek a deal
Yes, he did.
A joint government, or whatever you call it.
Right.
And Chiang Kai-shek, on the orders of his puppeteers in Washington, refused.
In fact, I brought this up because I've been giving talks on Okinawa, and I brought this up that going back to Vinegar Joe Stilwell, American general who was training the Chinese army for Chiang Kai-shek, was trying to tell the United States in various conversations that Chiang Kai-shek's a crook. A lot of the money, the hard taxpayer-earned money that we're giving to China is going south to the pockets. But he made a mistake. He used to call, in fact, it's in some of his diary entries. You know, remember Chiang Kai-shek was bald? Yeah, well, Stilwell had a nickname for him, Peanut. He made that mistake of saying that to his face, and he got fired. They sent him to Okinawa. And so, yeah, he got fired. But he didn't like Chiang Kai-shek. In fact, it's almost the same sort. There were some here who thought that we could work with Mao after the war. And the OSS said the same thing about Ho. We can work with this guy after the war. Well, what happened?
The French killed tens of thousands of people in North
Right.
Vietnam.
Right. I mean, we could have avoided Vietnam. We could have avoided Korea, most likely, if we sat down. But that's not what we're going to do here. That's not what we're, and you know what's going to happen after that. You know what's going to happen after that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to call on Daniel as
Sure.
our last questioner because it's almost time for us to end this program. Daniel, please go ahead.
Yes, Daniel here.
Yes, Daniel.
In the late 30s, the Soviet purges in the late 30s, according to many accounts that I've heard, they greatly weakened, they took out a huge percentage of their military personnel. And I'm wondering, to what degree would that have hurt the Soviets' ability to respond in the first part of, during all of World War II, especially during the first part of it. I wonder if those massive casualties could have been avoided if they had not purged so many of their their experienced military personnel. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, there were 80,000 men, 80,000 officers in the Soviet officer class. Stalin had at least 15,000 of them shot, but upwards of 35,000 were sent to Siberia. Of course, here, and what he did, I mean, he really, I mean, there were all 11 top political commissars for the military were all shot. 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals were shot, and one the kingpin here, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, which to me is a big mistake. There were others who were sent to Siberia, but many lower grade officers here were serving in the outlying districts. One of them was Zhukov, and the Soviet Union was somewhat blessed here that once the war starts, they will bring these officers back into the Soviet Union to fight the war against Nazi Germany. One of them was Konstantin Rokossovsky, and Rokossovsky had a Polish father and a Russian mother. He was a brilliant commander, and the NKVD is going to pull out his fingernails and toenails and send him to Siberia. But he will be rehabilitated. You know how that goes. Rehabilitated, and he will be made a commander. He will retire. He will retire from he would end the war as a lieutenant general, and he will be hero of the Soviet Union twice. What a country! And he will later be the commander-in-chief after the war of the Soviet Army. He's an interesting man to get to know, but he was a brilliant commander, just like Zhukov was, Vasily Chuikov, the defender at Stalingrad, Pavel Rotmitstrov. They had a number of Nikolai Vatutin, although he died under mysterious circumstances in 1944. But Ivan Konev, they had some commanders that were every bit as talented as a Patton, Montgomery, Bradley. These guys were really talented commanders, and Stalin's only going to learn from them in the end anyway. So which is why I made the comment by 1944, the Soviet Army is the most lethal killing machine as far as an army goes. That's the army I would have wanted. That's the army I would have wanted. Nothing against the United States Army. It's just that in this area, they had that kill instinct. The Germans aren't going to survive this. And that's that old Mongol way of waging war. That's the old Mongol way of waging war. You want to beat this army? No, you exterminate it if you can. That way you don't have to go around the block again. Yeah. Interesting. That's why you don't fight in the East. Don't go to the East. Different ball game here. Different ball game. Anyway, anybody else have any?
I had another one, Mark, if we have time. This is Mike.
Yes,
What
Mike.
I'm wondering is the intergenerational desire for revenge that is sometimes talked about, like the Chinese, what they're saying now is we had the century of humiliation and we're going to come out on top, we're going to get even. Or the thing in 1905 when the Russian-Japanese War happened and the Russians said, you know, we're going to get even with Japan for doing what we did. And it's happened all throughout history. I mean, you can go back to Alexander the Great, and the Greeks were taking revenge on the Persians for something that had happened 200 or 300 years before. So I'm wondering how this desire for revenge that's passed on to, you know, children and grandchildren, and how this plays out in some of what we're talking about.
Yeah, you're onto something here because, well, you can include India here. Weren't they part of the British Empire? And now look at India today. It's one of the bigger powers here. But having said that, you see here with China, they're coming on as a great power. They're rated number 2 economically here. But they understood, just like the United States understood when we made our run, that it's economics. You know, you needed to industrialize. Only today it's a technology, although you can't do it without industrialization, I'll give you that. But now it's the technology revolution. We came in towards the latter part of the Industrial Revolution, just like Stalin's Russia did. Now you're into the technology revolution, but the basic premise is the same. And you know, you can make the, and people are people, you know, we're going to get back those people who were colonial powers, what they did to us. And let's understand something. China had been a butt of colonialism. If you remember the 19th century into the 20th, the West had occupied a lot of the coastland of Eastern China. You know, they had carved it up like a Thanksgiving Day turkey. They really did. And this is, again, part of colonialism. And so now you're seeing 2 countries that had been the butts of colonialism, China, India, now taking their place on the world stage. What does that tell you about where the world's gone? That's fascinating. It truly is, you know. But in the end, let's understand something. People are people, Mike. If you stick them, they bleed. If they get young, they get old and they die. They laugh and they cry. Everybody, this is something with people. True, every country might have some difference in social mores, courtesies, the way they do things, the way they raise their kids. Okay, I'll give you that. But at the same time, people are people, and I'm gonna say this. Even though China is no different than anyone else, it'll get to that point where if they want to take something, they're going to go grab it.
Right.
They're not going to be any different than anyone else. They might not be doing that really now, but let's understand something. Do you know 100 countries have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, I knew it was a large number.
Yep, 100. You think 100 countries are signed on to us and along those lines?
No, not even.
Okay.
Right.
Well, thank you. We seem to have lost our moderator.
Yeah,
And I think it was time to end the program. So we'll end the recording and thank everybody for coming and remind you to tune in next week and make donations on our website and review this program on YouTube and Rumble. Thank you, everybody.